O'Fallon, Illinois, works with works with Justin. We were very excited to that she landed an internship, which turned into her first official planning position. She studied the home improvement curb appeal programs that were sponsored by municipalities. So she will present her findings, a brief presentation on her findings. Know that these capstones, there's a lot more to them. They will be publicly available by the end of the month. If you want to see the full capstone, just reach out to me and I'm happy to share it with you. Bryan Rogers is our second graduate student capstone presentation. Bryan Rogers is currently a long-range transportation planner for Bi-State and he will be presenting his capstone that looked at equitable development and government consolidation in St. Louis. Both of these programs, I'm sure you're going to have a lot of interesting questions at the end. Christy Volker will be managing the question and answer period. We'll have about 10 minutes of questions after each capstone, and Christy will be monitoring the chat and we'll be handling the questions. So with that, I want to turn it first over to Mary.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so like Dr. Coffin mentioned, I chose to study this semester home improvement programs that municipalities administer in-house. And specifically, I looked at curb appeal programs or residential facade improvement programs. So I'll talk a little bit about why I chose this as my topic, some of the motivation related to my internship that I was doing and now is my full-time job with O'Fallon, and what research questions and some of the background on the literature. And then I'll talk about, hopefully I'll talk a little bit about each of the case studies. There are 6 case studies, what I found from them and what that means. So when I first set out to do this research, I was looking into a bunch of different kinds of home improvement programs that municipalities sponsor. And there are tons of these, as you all probably know, everything from very comprehensive home rehab programs to very specific things like just weatherization or energy efficiency upgrades, even some like downtown apartment type of programs where you rehab the upper story of a commercial building into a residential unit. So very specific, but ultimately I decided I had to narrow in on one so that I could really compare the different case studies. And I chose to narrow in on residential exterior improvement or facade improvement or curb appeal. They're all kind of synonymous. And so the reason I chose to do this is I've been working with the city of O'Fallon, and they are in the process, we are in the process right now of wrapping up our comprehensive planning process for 2040. And one of the big priorities that's been identified is housing diversity. So currently there's a lot of new residential construction happening at the edges of the city. And, it's providing quality housing, but not necessarily attainable housing. So the city is really looking at how it can improve some of the older parts of town that need some maintenance and investment, and to maintain some of the diverse range of housing prices that the city has. Because O'Fallon is becoming a very desirable place to live. It has great schools. It's relatively close to downtown compared to some of the other growing suburbs in the region. And so looking at a program like this or some kind of home improvement program is something the city was interested in. And so this map kind of just shows what I was talking about with new residential construction happening. that pink boundary is the boundary of the city. So you can tell there's kind of been a lot of annexation with new residential development. And the different colors on the map are census tracts. So they don't really align with the boundaries of the city, but you can see the dark blue is census tracts that have had an increase in housing units over the last decade. And areas in pink or red are a decrease in the total number of housing units. So you can see that a lot of the addition of new housing has occurred at the edges of the city and not necessarily in the core of the city, where a lot of its older, more affordable, more attainable housing stock is. And just a quick overview of the city, its characteristics, demographics. Over the last decade, it has been growing, which again is not necessarily common in our region. So it's growing, it's becoming more affluent. And with that, it's becoming more expensive to live in O'Fallon. But it's also traditionally had pretty affordable housing opportunities for people. And it's growing in the number of units, like I mentioned, and it's becoming more single family homes and more owner occupied. And then in terms of income, I thought this was interesting how, one of these like pretty high income brackets is growing significantly, but also like a lower to moderate income bracket is growing significantly in the city as well. And so again, to bring it back to the purpose of the program, the city has expressed interest in creating a facade improvement program to improve the conditions in some of its older neighborhoods, specifically around downtown, which is more of a walkable community, well served by buses. So that was kind of the impetus for the program, for this research. So my research questions were really, how do we preserve and improve the older housing stock in all kinds of cities? But this was done with O'Fallon in mind. So suburbs that are aging, how do you improve some of the older housing stock in those cities? There's been a lot of emphasis on urban core cities, but maybe less on suburban cities. And how successful have those strategies been? And then also, what are some of the ways to fund a program like this? Because a lot of them do use federal funds, so like CDBG grants or home investment partnership grants. And then taking those research questions and looking at them through the lens of 6 different case studies. So quick overview of the literature. There isn't a lot of literature on this topic, and that was another reason I was interested in looking into this a little more. There have been some on commercial facade improvement programs, but those are also limited. I think the ones that I found were pretty much just master's level research projects like mine. So less robust research. And then also home repair needs are very significant. I think we all know that. Most homeowners have some kind of repair needs for their homes. And those are most acute for low to moderate income households, but they also exist across, all income groups. Homes are just expensive to maintain. I think there was one study done by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia that found that single-family homes, an average of 35% of single-family homes have repair needs, and those needs average about a cost of $3,200. The next point in the literature review was about how important housing diversity is. There was a study that looked at how communities that have more diverse types and price points of housing are more resilient in social and economic change. So they specifically looked at the effects of the foreclosure crisis. So cities that had less housing diversity were more vulnerable during the foreclosure crisis. And then there are also studies that came across that discuss the effects of home improvements. Obviously, when you talk about home improvement activity happening in a certain neighborhood, you often associate that with some kind of, maybe gentrification. But there hasn't been a ton of research that I could find on the connection between like a city-run home improvement program with its impact on gentrification. But there is research that home improvement activity does have positive spillover effects in the neighborhood in terms of spurring other home improvement activity and property values. And then finally, there's research on, and I think a lot of us know this in the community development world, that targeted initiatives can have more of an observable and sustained impact on communities rather than kind of like a dispersed approach. So I first started out by looking at what are all the programs out there that are like curb appeal or home or residential exterior improvement programs. And I found that there aren't that many. There are a few. So I didn't have to do too much work to narrow it down because it was already narrowed down for me. But I narrowed it down by mostly by funding sources because the city of O'Fallon doesn't have census tracts that meet the requirements for HUD CDBG grants. So I wanted to look at programs that used other sources of funding. And then also, specifically looking at the residential facade programs. And these are the 6 case studies that I ended up going with. So they're kind of all over the place in all different kinds of cities. Pittsburgh is the only urban core city that I looked at. But Arlington, Texas is a big city, part of the Dallas region. Green Bay is a smaller city, but isn't a suburb. It's a standalone city. And then Delray Beach and Coon Rapids are suburbs as well. And Carbondale was a useful case study because it's in Illinois, the same state as O'Fallon. So don't need to spend a ton of time on this. This is just a comparison of the demographics, but there's a lot of difference in the types of cities I looked at. And this, again, is a little bit too detailed to talk about, but this is a good reference if you're ever wondering about these kinds of programs, if you ever wanted to look back. I have this table that summarizes the components of each program. So the first one, let me check the time. Okay. The first one I looked at was Green Bay, Wisconsin, and theirs is only a couple years old. But the impetus for their program was they had this redevelopment project happening on their riverfront, and that was really championed by the mayor at the time. And this redevelopment was going to bring like new apartment buildings and green spaces and like a brewery. So, lots of kind of entertainment and recreational types of uses to this neighborhood that has had a lot of like vacancy over the years. And so as part of this impending redevelopment, the city wanted to put some money back into the residential neighborhood so that the homeowners are benefiting from and are partly kind of protected by maybe what's happening. So they did this neighborhood investment strategy, and they talked with neighbors in the area to understand what their sense of the community was and what kind of home improvement needs they had They also did the staff led a survey of the existing conditions of the neighborhood. And so this was kind of all the background work that led to creating a curb appeal program in Green Bay. And I think they had about 22 people in their first year. And at the time of the interview with them, they had 15 of the projects were completed. So they were, I think they felt that the program was going to be a good success, but it hasn't been around long enough to really know what kind of impact that it will have. But this is a good one, I think, to follow up on in the future and see how it's going. They were very organized and deliberate about surveying residents and conditions. So they're also going to do that in about 3 years, go back and survey the conditions and the residents to see what kind of impact it's had. Carbondale, Illinois. So this was, like I mentioned, useful because it's in the same state as O'Fallon. But Carbondale is a college town, so it's kind of unique in that sense. They deal with a lot of like a high proportion of rental properties, so more like of a transient residential population. And they created this program to hopefully reduce vacancy and increase home ownership. And they limited it to homeowner occupied properties. So rental properties couldn't participate in this program. What I learned from this program was that their marketing materials, like what they published on their website for citizens to read about the program, if they were interested, was not clear, not straightforward. They had the ordinance posted on the website of adopting the program. So it wasn't really a user-friendly set of information. And I think that created a lot of confusion for their residents. Their staff spent a lot of time taking calls and explaining to people what this program is for, explaining that this is a matching grant, explaining that, because it's a matching grant, they have to provide some funds up front. So I think with that, there's a lot of time involved in administering the program, but another important lesson from this one was that customer service, empathy, patience were really important in working with the residents who were frustrated or disappointed when they found out that this program didn't exactly suit their needs, but staff also helped redirect them to other programs like through IDA that do have more substantial home rehab programs. They also worked with the residents who had like a long list of things they wanted to do to their house that obviously wouldn't have been covered. I think the maximum grant you could get in this program was like $3,000. So really like couldn't go very far in terms of home improvements. So they really worked with their residents closely. Arlington, Texas was pretty unique because they, and actually this isn't just a residential facade program. This also includes like interior improvements. You can do interior improvements with the grant. Or I shouldn't say grant, because this one is actually a property tax rebate. So they do an assessment of your property to see what its value is. Or I guess they just use, I think they use the whatever tax year that was, assessment year that was. And then the homeowner has to do the improvements, and they have to do a minimum of $20,000 of improvements, which is pretty significant. And then the following year, if there's an increase in property value or property taxes, then the city will issue them a rebate. I think they multiply that increase by 10, I think, and then they get a rebate. But the issue with that is that if they do interior improvements, they can't really see that from the appraisal because the appraisal doesn't go inside the house unless it's a special appraisal. So you're not guaranteed to get a property tax rebate in this program. So that was a big limitation of it. The other limitation is that it is a high cost of entry. Not everybody has $20,000 lying around to just go improve their house. And then, you know, if you're not guaranteed any sort of like tax rebate or benefit from it. So they didn't have a lot of interest in this program, long story short. Over the last 3 years, I think they only had 4 people apply. And Arlington is a city of about, I think, 400,000 or close to 500,000. So, you know, that's pretty low in the scale of the city. But they also have a ton of other housing programs that have been more successful. And like, for instance, housing programs, and also they have this neighborhood matching grant program that is more on like a community scale. Delray Beach was the oldest program that I looked at. They've been around since 2007. So this was a good one because it's been pretty successful. It's very robust. They have a lot of funding. They actually will give residents who make up to 140% of the area median income a 100% grant. So residents don't have to match that any of the city's funding. So that is really great. And there's a lot of interest, obviously, because of that. But they are funded through tax increments. They have I think there's like a special law in Florida that community redevelopment agencies can be created. I think they're on a county-wide, or maybe, no, I think it's just city-wide basis. And they use, their revenues come primarily from tax increment revenues. So that's kind of a unique legal mechanism that allows this program to be so robust and steadily funded. Some other things that were kind of cool about Delray Beach, they provided like landscape, am I going way over? Okay, I'll hurry up. They provided landscape design services in-house from the city, which I was astounded by. So for every homeowner that participates, they have someone from the city look at their landscape and provide advice. And they also go out to each home and work with the homeowner to determine which improvements are most important and which ones should be prioritized. So they provide a lot of assistance. And then another interesting thing is they use the curb appeal program for roof replacement, because there are other programs that are funded. Their other housing programs require homeowners insurance, and sometimes they can't get insurance if they have significant roof repair needs. So what they do is they let homeowners use the curb appeal program to repair their roofs or replace their roofs so that they can participate in like a full rehab program. Okay, I'm going through too much detail here. Okay, Coon Rapids. Coon Rapids has been around for 2 years, so it's also kind of a new program. But they have had a ton of interest, even though they only provide like 15 to 25% of the total project cost. The city only pays 15 to 25%, but they've had tons of interest. I'd say this is maybe like a middle income suburb of the Twin Cities. So, you know, maybe that's because people have more means to improve their homes without too much of the city's help. But it has leveraged a lot of investment. And they did notice that people who weren't participating in the program, but lived next to somebody who did, ended up making improvements to their homes. That was shared through like city inspectors who've been going out and noticing activity happening, and also just from residents themselves. Pittsburgh, okay, so Pittsburgh was really unique because, like I said, it's the only urban core city. And they actually overhauled the way they, the eligibility for the program a few years ago. So originally, you didn't have to occupy the home as your primary residence, so it could be used by flippers and home investors. And there were no income limits. So it was kind of not used in the way they really wanted it to be used to serve their residents who had, more modest means. So they overhauled their criteria, and they've had much more success with that. Another thing they've done is change the eligible neighborhoods based on where community development investments are occurring. So like if a community development corporation is building new affordable housing in a certain area, they'll draw like kind of a buffer around that property, and then that is the neighborhood for that year that can participate in their residential facade improvement program, which is kind of a cool way to go about it. And they also have this opportunity fund that funds other housing programs, but I thought it was kind of an interesting thing just for funding, purposes. They fund those programs through real estate transfer taxes. So the city voted to increase real estate transfer taxes by 1% from like 4% to 5% to pay for their housing programs. So, and I think they raised, it's about like $10 million per year over the next 15 years. So a pretty significant amount of funds for housing programs. Okay, so real quickly, what I found was that there was a ton of demand and enthusiasm, obviously among residents. They're like, all the help we can get, that's great for making, improving our homes and making repairs to them. But the amount of funding that each city is able to provide obviously is the limiting factor. And that is one of the challenges, is securing funding every year. But there was a lot of support from the city councils to fund these programs. Like Carbondale, for instance, said that every time, in the middle of the fiscal year, they would go back to their city councils after they had run out of money for the program and ask for more, and the city council would always approve it. So there was a lot of support. But all of these cities also offer other more like comprehensive home improvement programs for things like code violations and health and safety needs. So these programs are all kind of complementary to more substantial home repair needs. There was a little bit of the keeping up with the Joneses effect that I talked about. Some of the cities mentioned that they noticed that it was their investment was encouraging other investment in homes. Beyond homeowner pride and gratitude, so obviously they were all very grateful for the city's assistance in helping them with their homes. These programs do hypothetically help. This is more philosophical, not actually like observed in any of these case studies, but helping people improve their homes hypothetically helps them sustain the equity in their home. So that was, one of the things that I talked about with some of the people I interviewed. Program evaluation is lacking. Only Green Bay had really created a strategy to gather data and evaluate their program. And they haven't even been able to do that yet because it's so new. So in general, all of these programs could benefit, and we could benefit as people who are maybe interested in establishing these programs in our own cities, from learning from the successes of these programs. And then finally, I just wanted to say that all the people I talked to, most of them were planners, were so helpful and really eager to talk to me and share their advice and their resources with me. And it just made me feel really good about entering the planning profession. And then so recommendations, this is, you know, to the city of O'Fallon to keep in mind as they create their own residential facade program, and in general to other cities who are interested in these. Kind of talked about some of these in the findings, but it's really important to have clear goals and objectives. So like, for instance, the city of Arlington wasn't too concerned that their program was being used by like home investors and it wasn't being limited to lower income residents, because their main objective was to improve the housing stock. So, you know, and they also, you know, were looking for ways to improve their program. But one of the things they said was that they want to improve their housing stock. So whatever means, you know, it requires to do that, that's good. Other cities were more interested in catering this to the residents who needed it more. Okay, I think I'm out of time. But so it's really important to know what your goals and objectives are, because that will help you design your program. The number 2 and number 3 kind of go along with each other. It's important to gather data so that we can see how successful these kinds of programs are and what issues they have and what kind of impacts they're having on communities. Layer with other home repair programs. That's super important, because if someone has exterior repair needs, chances are they also have interior repair needs or more substantial needs like HVAC systems, electrical, you know, like life and safety issues. Provide technical assistance. That's always beneficial. Clear communication, super important. And then I just wanted to end on, you know, the note that kind of the elephant in the room, that like if you're creating a program like this to maintain the older housing stock and make sure that there are more attainable home ownership opportunities for people in communities, this can help with that, but it can also, you know, potentially lead to issues of, you know, the more investment there is in neighborhoods, potentially leading to pressures on the homeowners who are there to begin with. So it's really important to be sensitive to that and find, you know, use other strategies to make sure that the original homeowners are being protected if these programs become so popular and, you know, spur a lot of investment and create some maybe gentrification pressure. So I think that is all. Yeah, all right.
Thank you, Mary, for your presentation. Everyone, the chat box is open. If you have any questions for Mary, can you please go ahead and send those in here? And we'll give everyone a minute to gather their questions for Mary. Well, I have a quick question real quick for you, Mary. How did you go about finding the programs, your case studies? Did you just Google like facade improvements?
Yeah, for the most part. I had to mess around with different keywords because they didn't always come up under facade improvement or home improvement or curb appeal. So yeah, just Google for the most part.
So Jonathan has a question for you. What was the outcome of the city that opened the program to all?
Arlington specifically, or so Arlington didn't have many like eligibility restrictions, so they had no income restrictions. They had, it wasn't limited to a certain neighborhood. It wasn't limited to homeowners. It was open to home investors as well. I would say that was the least successful program because they had so few people apply for it, and even some of the people that applied weren't able to get a rebate because their property value didn't increase enough, at least from what could be seen from the outside in a home appraisal. And then let's see who else opened it up to all. So Delray Beach was limited by neighborhood. It was a specific area of the city. Green Bay was limited. Carbondale was a citywide program, but they limited by income and by homeowner occupied. I think they had some success with it, but they didn't have enough funding to really have the scale of impact that they were hoping to have. Trying to think, Jonathan, was there a specific city that you're referring to?
No, it was more just, I thought at the end you mentioned one that just want the objective section where you mentioned they wanted a nice housing stock, so it didn't matter if it's out of town or not. Their mission was a housing stock, and I forget which city that was.
Yeah, that was Arlington, Texas.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I would say it wasn't very successful, but not necessarily because that was their objective, but because they didn't limit it, to certain people. Or actually, it was mostly because they had such a high, minimum project cost of $20,000. It was hard for people to participate.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Mary, I think you said Green Bay was the only one that had sort of evaluation built into their program. What was their method for evaluation? What was it they were tracking? And if you don't know specifically, yes, the follow-up to that is what sort of metrics would you recommend tracking to see the efficacy of these sorts of programs?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Green Bay used a survey tool from NeighborWorks America. And if you go to NeighborWorks America, I think it's called Success Measures or something. They have a lot of free survey tools available online. Some of them you have to pay for, but they're designed for nonprofits and municipalities to use. So they're low cost. So they used a pre-designed survey tool. They used two. One was kind of a door-to-door talking with residents survey, and that asked, how do you feel about your neighborhood? Do you talk to your neighbors regularly? Do you feel safe in your neighborhood? Kind of questions like that. And then the other survey tool was more of a physical conditions survey to help them create some kind of objective way to assess what the physical condition of the neighborhoods were. And so I think that doing, it depends on what the goals are, but I think doing a survey on conditions would be really important. And also if it's a program that's limited to a specific neighborhood, I think it's easier to measure and evaluate what the impact of a program is rather than citywide, because there's just so many variables to control for. So I think that the targeted approach seemed to be more successful across the case studies that I looked at. And I think it'd be easier to evaluate the program impact.
Okay, great. Well, I think if anyone has more questions for Mary, we will have some time at the end, so feel free to shoot those into the chat box. But now I believe we will hand things over to Bryan. Bryan Rogers. So you can take things from here.
All right, see if I can get this up and running right. All right, everyone see everything okay? We're good to go? Good deal. All right, thanks for having me out to share my capstone. I can say that this project started a long time ago, and the initial approach was how to marry for the Forward Through Ferguson report and this idea of merging St. Louis City and St. Louis County just based on inequities across the board in both areas. And with this discussion of merger just kind of still be not kind of, it's still a thing. The project just kept morphing and morphing and morphing, and it made me do a lot of research that kind of hit home on what is this like, why is this being pitched, and who is this being pitched from, and kind of opened up this can of worms attached to equity. And I start noticing that a lot of local governments were pitching this under different frameworks, one of which being equity. And I wanted to know if it was like, is it a marketing thing or what? Because that word is, it gets thrown around a lot just because there's certain things coming out that haven't, been out there before. Also, I grew up in Wellston, Missouri, which is an unincorporated area of North County, which some people call it a suburb, but it's right along the city limits. And I also spent most of my years in school out in Baldwin. So I was able to see these different perspectives between a city and a county. So it's kind of a personal connection to this project as well as just research for school. So a little bit of background. So formal consolidation of governments, it's been attempted on a number of different occasions. As you can see, 38 of these consolidations, but only 26 are true consolidations, which I'll build on the definition of what a true consolidation is in a minute. So from the period between 1921 and 1926, there were 132 formal consolidations attempted, but only 22 successful. So that shows you that however this is being pitched, it's not always like, oh, you can throw numbers in front of people and just convince them that there's a case for this. And as I mentioned, there's the framework that this is being pitched under is normally around government challenges, whether that be spending or driving economic development for their region. And also, like I said, equity is now a word used to pitch for government consolidation. So there's two types of consolidation. This functional approach is kind of interesting that Mary touched on the idea of having a focus and initiative, because that's kind of what this is. It's taking different entities and tying them together within each group's government to kind of hone in on one thing and leaving the rest of the entities alone. And there's also a new form come out called new localism, which I like to think of like the idea of like a 353 or something like that, where a big partner like a university can come in and kind of put some initiatives together with the community in partnership to drive development or drive prosperity for everyone that's around. And then there's structural government consolidation, which is just a full-on, everybody comes together. This is the like normal approach that's thrown out by local government. All entities are tied together and you move on from there. All right, so taking one piece of those different frameworks that this is pitched under, looking at how do different groups view government spending. Equity planning is normally based on outcome equity, kind of leveling that playing field. But when you look at the unit of analysis, whether it be state, county, the legislative, or if it's a race or ethnic group or just the individual, the perspectives are always different. And the idea of how the market looks at equity, is there opportunity within it for a certain group? Is it just about everything being equal across the board? Is it about leveling the playing field? So when I looked at this, I thought, okay, the goal would be how do you align all of these perspectives, which again, open a can of worms that you would probably not believe. So looking at development and impacts on minority communities, also, so I always I hear the whole Delmar divide thing constantly, and everyone else does. But there's a street in St. Louis, Dr. Martin Luther King, that turns into St. Charles Rock Road once you cross the city limits. That street speaks volumes when it comes to local government and how money's being spent, how tax increment finance has been used or be. Um, and this is also telling them that too. So when municipalities lose out on the ability to generate sales tax, they rely a lot on court fines. Um, so 21 municipalities in St. Louis County that obtain 20% or more of their general revenue from fines. That 20% doesn't seem high, but it's very high in such a small, concentrated little municipality. And there's so many up St. Charles Rock Road that you can kind of see how things change if you just take a ride. I know there's so many planets on here, like you're familiar with the Jane Jacobs walk. Like I would call this the Rogers ride. Get in your car, start at the beginning of Dr. Martin Luther King in downtown St. Louis and drive all the way until it ends and observe vacant buildings, close down schools, the sidewalks, just minor things that you can see how development has impacted the community overall. So in relation to this idea, the initial idea of tying the Ford through Ferguson report to this idea of merging St. Louis City and St. Louis County, I've recognized that it's all about appreciating the nodes. As Dr. Coffin mentioned during my introduction, like I work in transportation, but there's no way that I should only be focusing on transportation. Like there has to be an appreciation within all of these nodes. And local government can pitch merger all day, but unless it ties all of these things together, it's not going to happen. And that's because there's so many different things, there's so many different perspectives. That's why it's been wildly unpopular across the board over a large amount of time. But these are the things that have to be tied together to impact economy of scale, impact growth within a region. But there's stuff that I like to call gooiness that can't be measured, that you actually have to go to the community to find out about, and look at the past and kind of rebuild relationships. It's not something that can just be voted on and thrown out. So looking at St. Louis and the idea of merger, I intentionally labeled this his story because doing research on all of these attempts, as you can see from 1924 to 2019 till right now, there's been so many attempts, and I'm 100% sure I left some out just because they wouldn't all fit on this slide. But the most recent version proposed by Better Together sparked the idea of, okay, let's put this to a public vote because you would need to amend the Missouri Constitution to do this merger. But the vote would allow for regions that aren't even impacted by this within our metropolitan statistical area to vote on something that's pretty big. So you have no idea where the influence is coming in from. You have no idea how that's going to impact the minority communities. So it's always been kind of shunned by those communities because it's not. It's odd because it's very participatory, but and everything else isn't when it comes to local budget and stuff like that. So it's very bizarre. So I decided to do case studies on 3 different cities: Nashville, Tennessee; Louisville, Kentucky; and Indianapolis, Indiana. And the reason why I chose those 3 is because these are the 3, some of the cities, but these are the main 3 cities that I always hear people compare us to, um, whether it be population, but I just always had a fascination with, like, why do they keep bringing these cities up? So I picked it just based on complete qualitative, like word of mouth sort of thing. So looking into Nashville, so this was a structural consolidation back in 1967. So the idea, the pitch behind this, I like to use pitch because, like, to me, this is all marketing stuff. The pitch behind this was to equalize teacher salaries, which eliminated competition between the city and the county, of course. It got voted down multiple times, and what pushed them over the top was heavy representation from the Black community. They actually brought in a civil rights lawyer to kind of push their message forward. And after the consolidation, there was growth population-wise, but the government spending has, like, blown up so much so that there's actually a nonprofit right now calling for an investigation. Um, I'll build on that later on. So looking at Louisville, Kentucky, there's also structural consolidation. This was pushed by business leaders and government and local government, but also voted down multiple times. And that's that gooiness that's happening. So this was more of an incremental approach where they do that localism view of, all right, let's focus on education, let's focus on jobs, and kind of tie those efforts together and make the case later on to say, like, okay, we've proven that this works in these forms, we can do it all together. So they had something that I found very fascinating called the Compact in Louisville. And what it did was it gave concessions to different groups that like initially opposed the merger. So labor unions that were promised, like, new government would recognize the same collective bargaining rights. So they went back to the table to those honed in communities and said, okay, this is what we're going to do to help you all. It was actually operationalized. It wasn't just a fluff statement. And after consolidation, population did grow. There was a cost saving, and they've attracted a number of Fortune 500 companies. But the poverty rate is mind blowing, and inequalities are still there. So Indianapolis was the most fascinating one to me because there was no process. There was a structural consolidation that just got passed through the General Assembly. There was no public vote. And it was literally like everyone woke up and the government had consolidated. So they grew population-wise, also brought in a number of jobs. So government across the sort of achieved their goal of bringing in economic development, but let's see. But the poverty rate attached to that development it didn't do anything but grow. And it's all tied together. It's all proportionate to, as you can see right here, where looking at, I chose to look at GDP because it was more of a broad way of looking at, okay, what does this city produce? Like, what do they make money wise? But the issue with GDP is it doesn't account for cost of living or inflation. Like, these are things that are influenced by other nodes that, were attached to the decision to consolidate, but I don't think it was framed in an effort to impact minority communities in any way. So the idea of pitching equity across the board is not really there. So my key takeaways for this, it's imperative to include minority leadership, especially not just political. It's mind blowing that it's like all politics. I mean, I think it's just because there's this idea that it's being pitched by local government, so it's government, but there's a huge need for minority representation from all different backgrounds and sectors to have a voice in how this goes. And also being clear about plans and not having any fluff. I think one of the most mind-blowing things that I came across during research was the fact that there was so many 1 and 200 page plans that I had to read through that were just 200 pages of feel good stuff. That's why I said it was framed under marketing. It's not operationalized in any way. There's no real plan to do any. If I say I want job growth to come along, that's great. I don't need 100 pages of stuff to read to say job growth, yay. But if we're really gonna do something, there has to be a plan behind it. Also, in looking specifically at St. Louis, race relations in St. Louis is so damaged to the point where it's going to be tough to do anything on a large scale. So that's why certain relationships are starting to pop up. It's gonna have to be that approach of doing things that focus on education that's between the city and the county and making sure that works. It's gonna take an incremental way of thinking in order to prove to people that live here that this is a good idea. Also, to be innovative with financial mechanisms. Community benefits agreements are a huge deal. Using developer impact fees to fund different initiatives that are targeted towards minority communities. The idea the compact, not saying that we should do that exact thing, but that idea of going to a group and saying, oh, this is exactly how this program is going to impact you. How do you feel about that? I mentioned the participatory budgets and a shared tax base similar to Minneapolis would be a huge deal. But of course, it takes a village. So just for fun, what if planners from the city and planners from the county came together in a voluntary way and said, this is what equity looks like from us? That would be huge and also probable. New large scale projects should be held to more scrutiny, and this is starting to happen a little bit. Telling of when I started this project and how it's morphed tremendously. So developer impact fees could be added to new projects to fund public services, like I mentioned. So an appreciation for things like brownfield cleanups, transit development districts, and other things like that to kind of fund sites and services that impact communities of color. If economic development incentives should be crafted to help small businesses, since those are the businesses that have been there and they'll stay, or household and businesses should not be pushed out involuntarily for new development. And if so, it should be compensated based on whatever monetary value that new development intends to contribute to the overall region. And what if streets in the urban core were designed to be more people-centric, to include walkability as a focus to help people that may not be able to afford a car. These are the little things that I believe could help. They're gonna have to come in a smaller form, like I mentioned, but overall, looking at the 3 cities that I've studied, there's no implications that equity has anything to do with government consolidation at all. But that can be changed. So open to chat about it.
Thank you so much, Bryan, for that presentation. Very interesting stuff. So once again, in the chat box, if anyone has questions for Bryan, we have plenty of time, so you can go ahead and throw those in there. So Brian, you're going to be grilled by your professor here. You thought you were done with school, but you're not.
I know. Yeah. When I got the email from you to do this, I'm like, oh man, where did I put that paper and presentation?
Yeah, it's all right. It should still be pretty fresh in your mind, right? All right. So what thoughts do you have about the new approach to development in Ward 17? Alderwoman Peel is negotiating impact fees from developers that then are invested in lower resource neighborhoods.
It's exactly what I was talking about. And Dr. Coffin know that like I've said this stuff before that happened. So it's my idea first. But no, that's exactly what needs to happen. And I think there's just this weird like thought of if you build it, they will come approach. It's just weird. It's like, just make it about the people. Like the businesses are gonna come to the people. That should be it. Like I don't really understand the idea of like bring the businesses first and then hope that everyone fills it in. Like the people are already here. Give them something to believe in and maybe they'll believe in you.
Nice. All right. Any more questions for Brian? Well, it looks like you might be getting off easy here. Oh, wait, hold on. We have a couple questions. I was just about to, people needed some time to type. It's all right. Did you look at poverty rates over time in your case study cities?
Yeah, but I only looked at, so the GDP that I looked at was from 2000 to 2015. So I looked at poverty rate over that time period, but it was still pretty consistent across the board. Like I said, the population growth was pretty significant, but poverty rate was just proportionate. It was pretty much like riding the same wave.
All right. And a Bob Lewis question from Dr. Coffin. So what should consolidation look like?
I think stay tuned and we'll get to see. I think I think it's coming. I don't know if it's coming in my lifetime, but I do think that the fact that city executive and the mayor are talking and like there are what I consider them to be conduits that we haven't really taken advantage of, whether that be a metro or just a bi-state development, someone that's in the middle that's already doing stuff within a region to be used as kind of that platform to bring things together. So stuff like that has to happen first before we talk consolidation that would truly impact equity. We can figure out some way to push consolidation over, but it's more than likely just going to end up being a Nashville or Kentucky, or it's going to end up being like the cities before, where it's not that impactful. It's just satisfying whatever government challenges they're trying to solve.
All right, great. Thank you. Okay, well, we have, if anyone wants to throw in some last minute questions to the chat box, please do so now. I'll give one more. Aha, thank you, John Roper. How does education play a factor?
Ooh, man, St. Louis public schools. Oh man, our city is going through this weird change when it comes to education. Like seeing all the charter schools pop up and people are coming into the city but sending kids to private school. Like there's just no faith in St. Louis public schools based on like past performance. But all that stuff is extra other things. So they need help. They need something to believe in. I was a DSEG kid, like I mentioned. I wish there was some way for those two entities to work together education wise, so there wouldn't be a a gap. And maybe that's similar to what one of the other cities that I studied had done, where they're equalizing pay some way. So that way teachers aren't like, hey, I don't get paid enough to do this. I'm going to this small municipality. Yeah, it's a great question.
Great. Well, thank you. I think Mary came in with every time that I think,
you do know we
well,
can unmute ourselves and talk, right?
yeah, we can unmute ourselves and talk. If people have questions, they want to jump in. I just, don't want to sit here in awkward silence with anyone.
Yeah.
But we have another comment from Mary. Thank you. I also get frustrated with the issue of fluff in plans, and I was thinking the same thing, Mary. Can you think of any good examples you've come across? Sounds like the 3 case studies consolidation plans weren't good examples of operationalizing their goals.
I've seen a few, and I've seen some, I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, but the ones that I have seen have been like attached to that equity planning lens of like, oh, you're doing too much. You know what I mean? Where it's like, we want participatory budgets. Like that's a direct request. I've seen that, but it comes from a group that's considered radical. So it just kind of gets pushed off. I think the idea of like all of these power players that are involved in these things, like, sorry if I offended anyone, but I almost think they want this stuff to keep going, because I've seen a bunch of plans from a bunch of different cities that like they all say the same thing. Like, also, how much does it cost to create these plans? Like, who gets paid to do this? Because if I'm generating the income off of it, of course, I don't want you to solve the problem. I want to work on your 200-page report about how to make you feel good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jonathan had a follow-up to his question. For planners and land use, does land use nearby a school play a factor?
Definitely. One of the projects I'm working on right now is a transportation related thing, but I wanted to make it a point to look beyond ridership and look at land use, because of like, I don't want to just be mobility. Like, I need to be about access. So if I let my son walk outside to walk to school, like, I want him to be able to stop by the corner store and pick up a muffin before school. Like, there's little things that don't get appreciated, that people, like regular people, appreciate, that I don't even think they realize they appreciate it. It's just, these are the things that make up a community. So land use is a big deal. Yeah, it plays into everything, not just schools, but resident, like housing, all of those things. It's a very big deal.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you, Bryan, so much for your presentation. If anyone wants to jump in with a last minute question, please do. General question from Brett Burtock. The Metro Section Strategic Plan has goals and action plans that focus specifically on diversity and inclusion. Are we as a section actively working to achieve these goals? How can section members support these endeavors? So I can answer as part of the section board that we do have a diversity and inclusion committee that is chaired by Jess Henry. And so anyone who's interested in that committee's work can feel free to contact her. I believe that we had, if anyone wanted to serve on a committee, an email went out a while ago. But if anyone is interested in getting involved with that or wants to know what's going on with it, you can contact Jess Henry. All the board members' contact information should be on the APA Metro Sections website. All right. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, keep an eye out for announcements about the social we'll be having in July at 9 Mile Garden. We're going to be looking to have it on a weeknight. So I really look forward to seeing everyone there, and we'll get you that information as soon as possible. Thanks so much for attending today. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.